You know, Jesus was never in a rush. He was never hurried, and yet he was always on time. He always happened to be in the right place at the right time because he was submitted and led by the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God led him in what he did. And I know this to be true, that the more that we learn to be submitted and we throw our timetable aside and get on his timetable, he will end up putting us in the right places at the right time. So let's talk about that today. So there's this moment in the book of Ruth, it's chapter 2, verse 3, where it says, "And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz." I was struck by this language. She happened to come to the field, because we all know that Ruth was, she's in the lineage of Jesus. Her story changed that history. It's an amazing, beautiful story, but there's this little detail in this story that she just happened to land on the field, or to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. And there's something about how God just put her in the right place at the right time for the exact right season, for the exact right reason. And I'm always struck by these stories in the Word where somebody just happens to end up at the right place at the right time, in God's sovereignty and in his plan. Another example is Acts 8, when Philip is told by an angel of the Lord to go down the desert road to Gaza. And he just so happens, as he's going down that road, to run into the Ethiopian eunuch, who just so happens to be reading out of the book of Isaiah. And Philip just so happens to be the perfect person to come and say, "Hey, what are you reading?" And he says, "How will I know unless somebody tells me?" And Philip just so happens to be right there as one of the best people to possibly explain to the Ethiopian eunuch what the passage means. And he gets up in the carriage with him, and he reads it to him, and he preaches Jesus to him. He preaches the fulfillment to him, and they just so happen to be by a body of water in the desert. And the eunuch says, "Well, what prevents me from being baptized?" And Philip just so happens to be at the right place at the right time, and he baptizes the eunuch. And then in that moment, he is transported and taken away in the Spirit. And there is something that I just find beautiful about this lifestyle of when we remain submitted to the Spirit of God, to being led by the Spirit of God, being in a place of prayer, that God tends to just do this thing where he just puts us in the right place at the right time in circumstances that are bigger than we can possibly understand, and in ways that only he can get the credit. If you look at the life of Jesus, who obviously was God, but he had submitted himself to this mission and was led by the Spirit of God, and you find that he just went at his own pace. He went up to pray. He would spend all night in prayer, and then he would just so happen to be at the right place at the right time all the time. He was never in a hurry. He was never late, but he totally operated on a different timetable than the rest of the world. And I find that as believers, one of the things that we're called to is to operate on a different timetable than the rest of the world, because God has divine appointments and things that he wants to set up just in the mundaneness of life, that if we're on this hamster wheel of just going place to place, never having time to stop enough to think, stop enough to pray, that if we're on this hamster wheel, we'll never see these scenarios. And we had a men's prayer group thing last night at my house, a small group thing. It's got me churning on this idea of prayer. And one of the comments that one of the guys was talking about was like that God can do more with your little prayer time, your little section of time in prayer, than you can do with a full 24 hours. And I found that to be true. I have found that when I am slowed down enough, when I borrow or take or really prioritize my time from other things that could happen in my schedule, and I take that time to slow down and pray and to submit freshly to the Spirit of God and to be led by the Spirit of God, that God ends up putting me in the perfect place at the perfect time in so many crazy scenarios, things that I could not have dreamed up, things that I couldn't have even imagined would happen. One example is, and I've told this story in multiple formats, but there was one time I used to work for a bread company. They made sourdough sandwiches, all that kind of stuff. And we had this job. We were mobile salesmen. So we would actually go into different work offices and literally sell bread and sandwiches and cinnamon rolls to these different people in their businesses, as just kind of like we'd visit them on certain days. And one of the things that happened is one of the guys that I was talking with, this particular morning, he was just talking. He said, "Man, I've been talking to the Lord," and he's like, "Sometimes I get so discouraged by the amount of bread that I have sometimes when I come back and all that stuff." And the Lord was just telling him, "Man, take your eyes off the bread. Just focus on me. Take your eyes off the bread." And it's just so happened on that day that I was driving on usually one of my routes that was one of my most productive, fruitful routes that I had. And it was a big day, and I usually sold out of everything that I have. And on this particular day, nothing just seemed to go right. I kept missing everybody. I kept just not being on time. And I got to my second to last stop with the most bread, the most product that I had had at any time at that stop. And the goal was you wanted to come back to the warehouse or the restaurant that without having any product left. You wanted to sell out every day or have very few products to bring back. And I remember this day. I remember this phrase going into my, this phrase in my head that my coworker had said, "Get your eyes off of the bread." And so I pulled up to my second to last stop. It was a hospital, and I'm in the parking garage, and I'm discouraged because I'm like, I'm about to take a whole lot of product back to the warehouse, and this is not going to be good because it is my job to get rid of all this, and I'm going to come back with the most almost all that I had brought for the day was still with me. And I stopped what I was doing, and I felt the Lord literally just like pulling on my heart, just spend some time with me for a second. So I got out of the car, I went over to the end of the parking garage and just looked at the mountains, and I just expressed thankfulness. And I just took my eyes off of the circumstance for a moment, and I just prayed. I just was like, expressing gratitude, and I just refused to bow to this. I got to sell, I got to have this schedule, I got to get going. And so I spent some time, and then I felt clearly it was like okay, now. And so I took my bread and I went into the hospital, this place that I'd gone many times, usually not a very good customer, maybe buy a few things. And as I'm going in with the cart, this person pops out of a side door that I've never even seen open before. And she says, "You're the guy with the bread." And I said, "Yeah, that's me." And she said, "Come with me." And so I walk with her, and I go to the back room, and there are probably 25 people that have cash and cards in hand, and they literally buy me out of everything on my cart. I go back to my car, reload, and they buy me out of everything. I have 0 products left, all because when I'm walking through the hall, the right person caught me at the right time and got rid of everything in my cart, and they were overjoyed to buy my product. They bought whatever I had because they didn't. It was the first time I'd ever seen these people, but I just so happened to cross the hallway at exactly the right time for the exact right person to find me and take me down the hall to 25 people who had money and ready to go to buy my product. And if I had not stopped, if I had not set aside the time, if I had decided to just keep going on the hamster wheel, I probably would not have hit. I can almost guarantee I wouldn't have hit this person at the right time. And there's something about when we will slow down enough and refuse to get on the hamster wheel of the world, when we will learn how to be led by the Spirit and listen for His go, that it seems like He just ends up continually putting us in the right place at the right time. There's another example of this that I learned very, very early in my Christian life. I was 18 years old. I had we had a prayer ministry at our school, and we would pray 4 or 5 times a week, pray for a couple hours at night. We were just hungry, and we saw some incredible things happen. But it became big enough that the school board actually was fighting and arguing about whether or not we should be allowed to actually do this prayer group, because it was not just 5 kids huddled in a corner, but it was a lot of kids and using the gym and all of that stuff. So that whole thing's another story for another day. But the crazy The crazy thing about it is that one night we didn't know anything about any school board meeting. We're 18-year-old kids. We knew nothing. And we got together to pray, and we thought, you know what? We feel like we're supposed to pray at the school tonight. So we drove up to the school, and we went and we just laid our hands on the building and we prayed. And we didn't know what was going on, but we just put our hands on the building and we're just praying in the same way that we always had. And as we're praying, there's a mom that walks out of the main doors to our left, and she's got tears in her eyes, and she walks up and she puts her hands on the building too, and she starts praying with us. I had no idea who this lady was. I'd never met her in my life. But what we learned after we got done praying is that this lady said to us, "Do you know what's happening on the other side of this wall?" And we were like, I don't know. She said, "There's a school board meeting on the other side of the wall, and they are determining right now whether you are allowed to have this prayer group, this prayer meeting or not." We had zero idea, and yet God sent us right place, right time on the other side of the wall to be interceding in the very moment when they are deciding among the board members whether or not we're allowed to have this prayer group. And we had no idea. We had no idea. All we did was allow ourselves to be led by the Spirit. And there's something about a life that is submitted to Him in prayer, a life that is submitted to being on His timetable, to being on His schedule, instead of being in this hamster wheel all the time. This is one of the things we talked about in the men's group. Why is it that we don't prioritize prayer when it's clear that the Bible and the way that Jesus modeled, the early church modeled, is there was a prioritization of setting everything aside and seeking the Father's face, being on His timetable, under His leadership, under His schedule. Why do we not do that? And we live in a culture that wars against that very thing. The enemy strategy is to keep you so busy that you never have time to stop. But I'm telling you, I just want to encourage you today, reprioritize, reshape some things, because if you will find a way to set aside the time to just seek His face, to just submit to His schedule, submit to His timetable, you will be amazed. And I'm sure you guys have testimonies of this, and maybe we've lost our way in this or whatever. Use this as a fresh reminder to set this time aside, to lay down my schedule, to lay down all the things that I have to do, to get off the hamster wheel for a second and submit my time to the Lord Himself. And I'm telling you, there's something that happens in that where we end up being on His timetable, and He will end up over and over and over again putting us in the right place at the right time in scenarios where things will happen that only He can get the credit. I've seen it to be true in my life. I've seen it to be true in the Word. And I just want to encourage you that it is true. And this is just a fresh reminder. Make the time. Change your schedule. Get back on His schedule and watch as He realigns your schedule. Watch as He does more with the less of your schedule that you have. He does more with that than you could do with all of your schedule. I have some dear friends who have said to us since day one, and it's a mantra that they live by. It's a scripture, but it's a mantra that they live by in their own lives, and it's become part of our vocabulary. They always say, "The Lord orders our steps aright." They say it over and over again. The Lord orders our steps aright. And I fully believe that to be true. When we live in such a way where we are submitted in a place of prayer, where we prioritize time with Him, He can do more with our schedule, with even just a sliver of our schedule, than we can do with the entire thing. So I just want to encourage you, reprioritize. This is your wake-up call. This is your sign. Whatever's gotten in the way, as schedule creeps in, as more and more responsibilities get added to your plate, lay it down and make the time, because He can do more with your little sliver of prayer time than you can do with twice as much time in your own strength. I bless you. I encourage you. Lay it down and get on His timetable. Get on His schedule.